We're fortunate to have with us today Ekow Yankah. For those who were there this morning, it's his second talk today. And I gave a very long introduction and presentation of Ekow this morning, so I'm going to make things a bit briefer this afternoon. This is not to say that he's any less eminent than any of the other scholars that we got this year. In fact, probably one of the most eminent. Ekow is a professor of law at Cardozo Law School in New York City, has degrees from some of the most eminent institutions, both from the United States and England, the University of Michigan, Columbia Law School, and the Faculty of Law at Oxford University. He has published in countless leading journals on issue mostly focused on criminal law theory, theory of substantive criminal law, theory of criminal procedure, really advancing a line that defends an Aristotelian Republican theory, view about civic bonds as to what really holds society together and what criminal law ought to track in various ways. And what he's going to present to us today is really a portion of that project, which is really a book project. I don't know what the title of the book yet. Is there a title?
There's a working title, For We Are All Bonded.
For We Are All Bonded, which will be in a library near you within the next
10 years.
2 years. In any case, something to look out for. Ekow has also been a very active public intellectual of late, commenting both in print media as well as TV channels on issues of race relations and U.S. criminal procedure and constitutional law. That's what he was speaking about this morning. We're asking him to take a step back this afternoon to speak about broader dimension of his project. So he's going to present to us a work in progress. Again, we didn't circulate a paper for today, so Ekow is going to introduce us to his ideas, speaking on franchise as political obligation, what we owe others, foreigners, and immigrants. So without further ado, Professor Ekow Yankah.
Well, thank you very much, Francois. Thanks for having me again. Do I need the microphone or are we okay? I think it's a small room. So I'm just as happy with a short introduction. I only worry that my accomplishments have shrunk since just this morning, which is a shame. But all kidding aside, thank you for having me. It's been a terrific day. It was a real pleasure meeting your students. They were absolutely terrific. Thank you for babysitting me. I know how busy everybody is. So Francois promised me, here come the disclaimers. Francois promised me that it was okay to present a paper very much in production. And by very much in production, it is in a very, very rough stage. The usual compliments apply. This means that your comments will be taken seriously, as opposed to when people say your comments will be taken seriously and they really mean I'm only changing commas from here on in. Because this is a chapter in my book that I've just turned to drafting. A note on that chapter, in fact, if I'm even really honest, I'm redrafting constantly. And in part, I've had to, like many of you, I've been a bit shaken, stunned, devastated is the word I'm looking for, by the recent election of Donald Trump in America. And when you're writing a book on civic bonds as the basis of political obligation, an event that is in at least some parts a repudiation of the ways in which people imagine their civic bonds is truly unsettling. It's not often that you have philosophical crises, but this has, for me, been one of them. So it's been a difficult time. I say that also because I'm about to speak on what we owe civic strangers. And I'm well aware, forgive me, I'm well aware that this is a very sensitive time to be having such a discussion, a rightfully sensitive time. And in particular, because I propose a Republican theory of political obligation, one that I'm well aware can be misused, can undergird ugly sentiments. I come to this with some caution, but my hope is that the theory withstands inspection. To be honest, there are moments in the last 2 weeks where I've lost faith in my theory. What is true is that the competing theories which call for shelter or haven in this period, theories like Heather Gerken, who speaks about interest group alignments, give me even less reason to hope than my theory. So if I'm not in a great place, I don't see shelter in other people's invitations. So that's where I am. This is a bit more therapy session than you'd hope for, but I'm afraid that's what happens when your country elects Donald Trump. Okay. Lastly, as Francois said, this is a chapter in the book. I'll say one last thing. Originally, to now my shame, this was going to be the last chapter in the book. And it's actually now clear to me why that was. So I'd hoped to build an Aristotelian theory. Some people here know this project, an Aristotelian theory of political obligation, and then spend some time applying that to criminal law. And the idea was that I could build a very attractive and persuasive picture and then ultimately say, okay, now what, given all that, do we owe those who aren't included in the picture? Until some friends and interlocutors pointed out to me that this was a sort of, A, it sent the wrong message, and B, it was cowardly. There was something about avoiding the sharpest edge, the sharpest implications of Republican theory, and hoping to sneak it in at the end so that people wouldn't mind. That was cowardly. And so even the placement of this chapter is undergoing some serious reconstruction. With all that being said, here we go. So in one of his earlier contributions to an ancient philosophical debate, Jeremy Waldron evoked cosmopolitan life and values. Evocatively, Waldron describes you might think, postmodern cosmopolitan life embodied in a man, and I quote now, who lives in San Francisco, is of Irish ancestry, and does not take his identity to be compromised when he learns Spanish, eats Chinese, wears clothes made in Korea, listens to aria by Verdi sung by a Maori princess on Japanese equipment, follows Ukrainian politics, and practices Buddhist meditation techniques. He's a creature of modernity, conscious of living in a mixed up world and having a mixed up self. This is, of course, an elegant and inviting picture, one that many people in this room will know very well. The picture itself has actually invited many people to critique Waldron and other cosmopolitans as shallow, as having a commitment to only the thinnest veneer of cosmopolitanism without any seriousness. The idea is you take and choose, but in the end, you listen to the same arias you would have listened to anywhere. You end up in the same restaurants, just with slightly different images in Paris, New York, or Hong Kong. And thus, there's a rejection of this as a deep basis of cosmopolitanism itself. That is not the critique I want to level here. I actually find Jeremy Waldron's picture not just attractive, but perfectly natural. I was born in America myself, but I spent my childhood in Ghana before returning as a boy. My education, as Francois mentioned, spanned the Midwest from my beloved University of Michigan to New York to various European capitals. I've been spoiled by the rewards of academic life, and so I am much too concerned with from what region my wines are produced or what Italian elves sewed my jackets together. I'm blessed with family and friends from all over the world. We email, we Skype, we talk about when we can see each other on rare occasions, and we sometimes playfully, though not entirely playfully, joke about who among us have seen more of the world, more of the wonders of the world. So I find myself a strange person to reject or to be cast as the anti-cosmopolitan. But I'm here to see if I can make a Republican picture that focuses on the civic bonds of a particular polity attractive. By Republican, obviously I don't mean anything that tracks our current political debate. You will not be surprised to know that I was not a fan of Donald Trump. But by Republican here, I mean the ancient philosophical discourse. And by the way, the discourse that for thousands of years was more or less unchallenged, that elevated the way in which one was connected to their particular polity. First and most evocatively, probably first is strong, most evocatively and definitively forwarded by Aristotle. Now, these views and the current political debate have at least some small things in common, but I think quite frankly very small, and I'll return to those later. But given the sophistication that both cosmopolitans and Republicans typically add to their theory, it may be just as important for me to make clear what I'm not arguing. It's important for me to try to be precise about the grounds of my disagreement with cosmopolitans. After clarifying what I still take to be important disagreements between cosmopolitans and Republicans, I will argue that the Republican theories both are the most intuitive and attractive reconstruction of our ethical, moral, and political lives, and more importantly, can be made morally attractive with questions of what we owe those who do not share our polity, what we owe civic strangers. When I return to the question of what we owe civic strangers, I want to end with what I might take to be the upshot or the cash value of this paper. In particular, I want to end with a question with a picture of limited but morally defensible and attractive duties that we owe to civic strangers that live outside our community, in particular when it comes to humanitarian aid or the poor, or much poorer citizens who live in different countries, and perhaps much more important for the moment in which we find ourselves, the question of what we owe strangers that live among us. That is to say, when are we obligated to allow some into our polity? How far may we go in shutting the doors to our political community? And in particular, when may we deny citizenship to those who have lived much of their lives, or perhaps even for generations, among us? Okay. It'd be impossible to capture in any single evocation a cosmopolitan theory that would capture all the leading advocates. What I'll do instead is I'll sketch a very quick cosmopolitan picture that I think will be recognizable, one that I don't think would cause any avowed cosmopolitan to leap out of their seats and reject, and hope that that suffices. I do so hoping that I don't paint a thin picture or a straw man, not just because I want to be intellectually honest, but because I think there's much in the cosmopolitan theory that's actually very attractive, and I want to give it a fair shake. So cosmopolitanism, as I understand it, forwards two vital claims. The first is that the primary source of moral concern is in persons as such, right? That is to say, it is persons and not cultures, or perhaps even things or practices, that are the source of moral value. Other groups, such as institutions, families, tribes, religions, or nations, may be of interest, but they're of interest to us in a moral sense only indirectly, insofar as they affect individual persons that comprise them. The second and related claim recognizes that the moral worth attaches to single persons. And attaches to single persons universally, is what I mean to say. That is to say, we'll call it a universalizable and a generalizable provision. That is to say, cosmopolitanism gives us the very plain insight that there's something bizarre about imagining that you ought to be more morally valuable to me because you were born on one side of the Rio Grande than if you were born on the other side of the Rio Grande. So these two claims taken together seem rather simple, but they have remarkable implications. If all human beings deserve equal concern, regardless of where they were born, then the vast material inequalities faced by different people all over the world due to their place of birth is unjustifiable. Lest these differences seem too abstract, we should be clear. Over half the world lives on less than $3 a day, and over half of those people live on under $1.50 a day. So the mere bad luck of being born in the favelas of Brazil or a failed state in Africa or Indonesia is the difference between pursuing your education, developing your taste, reading philosophy as work, traveling the world for enjoyment, or living a life of crushing poverty with only occasional far-off dreams that reflect any hope of deeper human development. Those claims, I take it, are the grounds of what you might call a moral cosmopolitanism. The idea that our bonds to those near and dear to us are morally at least difficult to justify. Now, most cosmopolitans make some space, though begrudgingly, for these bonds of the near and dear. And sometimes they do so only for instrumental reasons, which I'll revisit in just a second. But in any case, the impulse is to at least increase one's understanding that other people should be taken to be just as morally significant as you, and as those you hold dear for traditional reasons, such as the bonds of your family, tribe, and especially your countrymen. Okay, so far I've tried to describe the impulse under moral cosmopolitanism, and the idea that this view drains the importance of traditional circles of influence. And if we take moral cosmopolitanism to be persuasive, as some do, we'd be obligated to radically change our lives to meet our moral duties. For there's much we can do, even voluntarily. Peter Singer, for example, has shown that without trading very much of our actual benefit or in terms of our standard of living, or even perhaps our felt benefits of life, we could dramatically change the way in which people in the poorest nations in the world live simply by giving some small percentage of our wealth. By small percentage, of course, he means small relative to our well-being, but large relative to what people normally take to be their duties of charity. So if people were obligated to give 10, 20, 30, or 50% of what they made in the Western world, in the wealthy Western world, they would by all measures still have a wonderful life and be able to vastly change the lives of those who live around the world. Now I want to engage in a rather large jump. I want to turn from what might just be a moral command to us to change the ways in which we voluntarily give up wealth to what one might think of as legal cosmopolitanism. Even though I understand this is a big jump, I take it to be the heart of the cosmopolitan project, at least in legal theory. Even in doing this, I want to isolate a couple different types of cosmopolitanism. And again, let me repeat, I want to get to the core of what I take to be the cosmopolitan claim, the true heartbeat. So for example, I want to avoid what I take to be a limited version that I think of as justice cosmopolitanism. This is best captured in the work of Betts, for example. Justice cosmopolitanism, really briefly, is just the idea that the wealthiest countries in the world have established a global economic order in such a way as to benefit themselves, and in doing so consistently undermine the ability of the poorest countries in the world to compete. If that's the case, then it's true in a real sense that the wealthiest countries in the world cause the poverty of the poorest countries in the world, and thus would be obligated in a claim of justice to repair it. That's not the kind of view I want to attack, right? To the extent Betts is right that we cause poverty, I take it as plausible that it is more than plausible. It flows from that we have duties of reparation. The only reason I want to avoid those views is I actually don't think those views are particularly or uniquely cosmopolitan. I think if it's the fact that your polis causes damage, that's totally compatible with the Republican view. Indeed, there are Republican views that would make more sense of it. The stronger strain, closer to the central cosmopolitan claims I'm after, indict wealth as such, right? So the claim is, even if a country were to have gained its wealth through roughly just but nationally self-interested bargaining, it would be unjust in continuing to hold that wealth, right? So the claim here is basically Rawlsian, for those of you who remember your Rawls. The idea is, if you're behind the veil of ignorance, you wouldn't know whether or not you're going to be the member of a rich community or a poor community, and thus you would want to set up the institutions of your society in order to share the wealth. Now, of course, Rawls in Law of Peoples contained that thinking to a single community. So Rawls was not in this sense a cosmopolitan, but Betts takes the same sort of idea and makes it into a cosmopolitan claim that we have no reason to prefer those of our polity versus another, given that we in some real sense don't deserve the wealth of our nation. That's the claim. So under the stronger form of this cosmopolitanism, the wealth of a particular nation cannot, in a deep sense, be considered theirs, right? I think the stronger claim gets to the group of ideas I want to inspect. Notice that the feature of this kind of cosmopolitanism undermines the reason it's justified to prefer the interests of your country over that of another. Its critical motivation is undermining or suppressing unjustified ethical, moral, or political reasons to prefer your nation to another. And that, I think, is the unifying cosmopolitan thread. Lastly, as I mentioned, most cosmopolitans typically begrudgingly make space for the bonds one has with those near and dear to them. So Martha Nussbaum famously says, Nussbaum, who, as many of you know, is a terrifically elegant writer, Nussbaum to me captures nicely what the real cosmopolitan heartbeat is. She tries her best to pretend to care about bonds of those who are near and dear. So she writes things like, I understand that even though these cosmopolitan values are morally correct and better, they're not as colorful or as charming as caring about those near and dear to you. And this seems to me the best she can work up in terms of sympathy of having bonds to your countrymen, right? As though there was some cute colloquial accident that happened. And by her lights, even if those things are to maintain their existence, civic education would be would be best served in trying to teach people to suppress those instincts and greater understand the ways in which they're bonded to everybody, right? Waldron equally says Waldron writes in the series of papers that he can't understand the justified rights to protect your culture as against interruption and dislocation because he doesn't believe that belonging to a particular culture is necessary for well-being. Okay. The last thing I'll say is the last kind of cosmopolitanism that you occasionally see is what you might call an instrumental cosmopolitanism, something which I think people like Nussbaum and I think Kant in certain realms seems to have. This is the kind of cosmopolitanism that says it's okay for you to have bonds to those near and dear to you if it's just the best way of meeting your universal ethical duties. But as a matter of being bonded to people, it is a matter of convenience or instrumental reliability. I'll actually use an example that Nussbaum uses to make clear how powerful a point this is. Nussbaum says, everybody has a duty to care for children, right? But I have a duty to care for my child, right? Her child, I think, is named Rachel. I know this because she writes about Rachel, right? She says, I have a duty to care for Rachel Nussbaum because the best way for everybody to meet their duties to care for children is for everybody to take care of their children. Now, on the one hand, the structure of this is perfectly logical, but I do want to take a moment to highlight for people how startling a claim this is, right? So I have 2 children of my own. I do not take it to be the case that the reason I have to care for my children is that I just happen to be well placed to care for my children. And I would find it bizarre if Palma, who presumably would be a better mother than I am a father, pointed out that she was willing to take over and be better placed to care for my children, right? That kind of claim just wouldn't meet the way in which I view my obligation to my children. I say this just because I think when you hear these cosmopolitan claims calmly stated, they have a way of lulling people into agreement. But we should be clear that whatever else is true, these are radically important claims, even if you think you're allowed to have personal ties just for instrumental reasons. All right, that brings me now to my claims, my anti-cosmopolitan claims, which I will try to sketch out quickly before turning to what we owe others. So as I said, if the cosmopolitan claims are attractive, they are also powerful. They start with what seems simple and compelling moral claims, and yet the cosmopolitan wave ends with a tsunami of radical implications. Still, however true it is that technology and the possibility of travel allow a small group of the world's educated elite to live as global citizens, it's fair to say we don't live in anything like a cosmopolitan world. Most people take it as utterly given that they owe those special consideration who are near and dear to them and extend these bonds, even if in elitated form, to their countrymen and to citizens and fellow countrymen. Thus, we're either completely misunderstanding or ignoring our moral and political duties, or something in the theory has gone amiss. In another chapter of this book project, I've expanded on what I take to be Republican theories of political obligation grounded in Aristotelian claims. For our purposes, I'll only sketch these out, and I'll add some notes more directly relevant to our inquiry. So I'll start with invoking Aristotle's famous encapsulation that man is not just a rational animal, and man is not indeed just a social animal, but man is a political animal. By this, Aristotle means that rationality is expressed both individually and in common. That is to say, we don't just, as he says, live beside each other. We live with each other. We come to understand and define what counts as worthy and good together. We pursue that which is worthy and good together. As Alexander McIntyre reminds us, we are born into a narrative. We're born into a story. We're born into communities. And those communities started before we came and will exist after we're gone. And those communities deeply define the way in which we measure ethical success. One thin way of understanding this is that many good things can't be pursued without us coming together, without us defining authoritatively how it is we're to act. That's plain enough, but that, I think, doesn't get to the depth of the claim. The second level of the claim is that what we take to be acceptably moral behavior is often defined in common. Right? So the difference between being an underground drug lord and being a pharmaceutical magnate often just depends on what your community has decided about the drug to which you have access, right? Whether or not you're Pablo Escobar or the CEO of Merck turns on a huge number of things, including how your community comes to view that which you're doing. But even that claim, I think, doesn't get deep enough. The claim I want to point out is that our very ethical and moral sensibilities are deeply defined, both by our communities and, in the larger sense of community, by our polity. That is to say, I want to push back on the cosmopolitan claim by pointing out that while it may be arbitrary where you were born, it is not morally arbitrary that you were born there. So while cosmopolitans see this as just a fact about the world, most of us take this to be a natural fact about the world that's deeply meaningful about the way in which we view our identity and our relationships to others. How you view yourself, your relationship to your elders, to your children, to your friends, and those obligations are deeply defined by the society into which you were born. What gives offense, what counts as praise, what counts as success, how one meets others, how one courts others, how one marries others, and who's appropriate to be in love with, all turn out to depend deeply on the community in which you were born. A friend of mine gave me a startling example of this recently. She's a Canadian who spent years in Kenya. I don't know if there are any Kenyans here. How good am I at this? I import a brilliant Kenyan to help me with the project. It'd be even slightly more useful to me if you were a Kenyan woman, but I'm not going to be picky. So I've come to understand, she reports to me that when Kenyan women give birth, they do so in near silence. Is that right? Have you seen a Kenyan woman give birth?
No, if you remember.
Yeah, I was going to say, the one time you were there, you probably don't remember. That's right. I take this on very good authority because she's an expert in healthcare and she helped literally hundreds of women give birth. So I have no reason to doubt her statistical experience or her veracity, right? So it turns out, I presume, as wonderful as Kenyan women are, they also feel pain. But it turns out that it's culturally important that one doesn't scream when giving birth in Kenya. So many women train themselves through all sorts of ways, including holding on to things, et cetera, to give birth in almost near silence, right? I just want to remind us what a remarkable fact this is. Even the way in which you experience pain is deeply defined by the culture in which you find yourself, right? And for those of us who've moved from culture to culture, you will understand this, if not in nearly. Being a man with 2 children, I understand that I'm a coward and not nearly up to this. But even in more minor ways, you come to understand how deeply inflected every moral process is by the culture in which you grow. What it means to satisfy moral requirements will vary from society to society. Now, we needn't be ridiculous, Pollyannish, or blind about this. Of course, this won't be total. People are part of multiple communities and multiple societies. And it's really important that in a healthy society, people will reject certain moral claims. People push back, they fight, they change. And of course, under extreme circumstances, some people move. Not just move, but move as a total rejection. But even that being said, I take Sam Scheffler's words that to be a part of a community that you reject is not the same thing as never having been part of that community. You define yourself in important ways by the communities against which you push, as well as the communities which you accept. And I also think, by the way, that cosmopolitans make too much of what it means when people move. There's a sort of oddness in the cosmopolitan literature to say, but you can move. And I always wonder, who are these people? Haven't they moved? Those of us who move find that there are endless moments of realizing that the things you take to be normal moral claims are just vastly different when you move cultures. There are little cultural bumps. There are ways in which you don't understand people, flirtations that go awry. I assume that's why they went awry. I cannot imagine why else my flirtations would have gone awry. There are ways in which you can give effect. These things are endless and repetitive when you move across cultures. And it is only as you live in a culture for a long time that you even come to understand how it is that the thing you did was incorrect or inaccessible. So I find it odd that cosmopolitans imagine that you can simply move as a way of avoiding these things, right? All right. So the kind of Republican theories I take, and I will quickly point out that I take these to be Republican theories, not communitarian theories. One of the distinctions here is that it will turn out that it's not enough for your community to claim simply that it is a community, but the distinction that Aristotle makes, it's one of the distinctions I highlight between Aristotle and Plato, is that what matters is the way in which your community can claim that your actions affect the civic community, right? So that there is a different space for your personal life and your civic life, a distinction which I'm happy to go into in more depth. The point there, though, is there will be certain forms of shared cultural values which reflect on your civic life as such. And those will be open to ways in which you circle to pursue the common good. If these forms of shared life are both necessary and good for participants, then it'll turn out that the only way to meet this human good is to participate in them and is to be given a voice in the pursuit of this common good as a part of this community. This is important, I take it, because each community will pursue its version of the common good, right? Now, this is a bit easier to explain here because, again, cosmopolitans often speak as though the moral goods in the world are transcendent of cultural values. But it helps to be in an adjacent but different country to discuss this. So it turns out that my Canadian friends are deeply irritated when Americans refer to them as that cute attic, right, upstairs from us, as though you were an adjacent province or state which we could visit and take as we wish. And by the way, it is odd, right? Toronto is so culturally familiar that sometimes I forget that I have to take my passport if I'm coming here, and I pull out money and it turns out it's not my money. It's this odd, charming, transparent version of what real money looks like. But these features are important to notice because it turns out that Canadians and Americans have faced many of the same social problems and answered the question of how they're going to face them as a community in remarkably different ways. I only need to point to your healthcare system and our current debate on how we treat the public goods that are associated with this to show the ways in which different communities will approach things vastly differently. And the problem I take with certain cosmopolitan views is not that they're shallow. It's that they don't recognize the way in which these reasons are reasons. That the reasons that are attached to your community, just because they're the ways in which your civic community has decided to define ways of pursuing the common good, should be respected as such. One way to put it might be in a community where it's just perfectly normal that every aging elder lives at home, there'll be a very different allocation of public resources than a community that takes it to be a public good that there be homes for the aged. And there'll be no way of explaining that to people unless they understand that in your community, it is only acceptable or largely acceptable or overwhelmingly acceptable, right? Again, to use a personal example, for my family moving here from Ghana, it was just radically, at least for my mother, I mean, for me, I was more or less raised American, but for my mother, it was a radical rethinking to understand that an entire community had decided that aged parents could live elsewhere, right? Or frankly, not only could, but should live elsewhere, that public funds should be made to make their lives independent, right? Americans read that as independent, Guineans read that as banishment. Right? And those are conversations and reasons you can only understand once you gain access to that civic polity. Right? Ultimately, that means those who understand these reasons and come to understand these reasons ought to have a voice in the shape of the particular polity, and they must have a voice in the shape of that polity by those who understand not just that their lives are affected by the decisions of that polity, but take themselves to have a shared fate within that polity. That country lines are to some extent arbitrary does not make them morally irrelevant, and that ultimately means that a polity will have some interest in the way it's self-constituted and will rightfully understand itself to be bonded to those within while having some control of those who can enter. Though, of course, not all control is total. I mean, obviously, polities don't have total control of who can enter. Even if you accept that your fellow citizens, you wouldn't have control of who enters your polity, insofar as you won't know how many children they have, what kind of children they have, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the basic Republican idea that I flesh out in earlier chapters. But it's an idea of polities belonging to each other and thus having reasons to care about each other as a polity and of the character of that polity. And of having a voice in that polity so long as you share a fate. Okay, I'm already running out of time, so let me try to finish quickly. All right, that was a long way to go, but now we see some features that are important. We see that under this view, civic strangers will have modest levels of political rights as a matter of right, but that this Republican view stands against the mostly politically progressive versions of immigrant rights, which attempt to move the right of citizenship or full access to political rights to human rights. So it is true that my view stands against views that would give all people access to all the rights of citizenship. Now, even though I'm running out of time, I do want to say one brief word about this. One of the things that always startles me is that among my colleagues, my philosophical colleagues who I respect a great deal, there is a strange feature that their philosophical theories only produce answers they like. I find this startling. I find it very weird if your philosophy only produces answers for which you would vote, right? Because the question I take myself to be engaged in is, what is a permissible or justifiable feature of a polity? Which is not the same question as what features would I vote for? And it would be odd if the only things that my polity could do were the things with which I agreed. And so there must be a distinction between that which a polity is permitted to do and that which I think is ideal for it to do. That being said, let's turn now to our question. I take it such a view would undermine those who claim that humanitarian aid is a claim of right. That is to say, you would still have some powerful claims about humanitarian aid. In particular, I should rush to mention, reparative claims are even more powerful under this view. One of the problems with views that take human beings everywhere as individual rights bearers is that it's actually very hard to explain to somebody why, if they are not currently advantaged by a past wrong that their polity did, they should owe any duties of repair, right? So if you're a French person who says, but look, whatever our colonization of Algeria looked like, it doesn't advantage me today. Why should I have anything to do with it? Or in America, the classic crueler question is, I didn't hold slaves. What does that have to do with me? There's a whole generation of Germans now who I think out of very explicit rejection of a certain German guilt have said, I wasn't a Nazi, has nothing to do with me. My position, I think, as at least one powerful attraction, pushes back against that. By understanding that you're a member of a polity, it makes one at least in part responsible for that which came before. So reparative claims would be more powerful. That being said, where there are no reparative claims, where it's true that your polity didn't do anything, it wouldn't be as clear that you'd have a duty for humanitarian aid. The right to asylum, I think, is a little more complicated. I think almost every theory has a right to asylum. Cosmopolitanism and Cicero have had a right to asylum. Kant had a right to asylum. And so too do Republican theories have a view that if you're in a position to help those, you can't cast them out if it's going to destroy their body. So I'm tempted to say, though I'm still thinking it out, that if one is capable, one is surely obligated to provide asylum to those for whom lack of asylum would be fatal. But with that being said, let me just make one more note. While it may be true that this theory has as a weakness the lack of a duty for humanitarian aid, it's not clear to me that that's a fatal weakness. After all, there's something strange about thinking that all that would matter is whether or not you have a duty to humanitarian aid. That is to say, there are things we do not because they are perfect duties. In Kantian language, they'd be imperfect duties. But even by ordinary moral language, we aspire to do more than that which we're obligated to do. We help people when we have great means, and they don't because we aspire to be the kinds of people that we admire. We aspire to be the kinds of people that we can say, we don't wish to be the kind of polity that, despite our great wealth, cares nothing for the suffering of others. And so I think sometimes it's a mistake to hope or to place the only ways in which we can help people as a matter of political duty. Now, in conclusion, the hardest question: what to do with those who live among us? So some will be disappointed to know that this theory does not produce a strong political right to citizenship as such. Indeed, under this theory, a polity reserves the right to shape its own character and can be biased as to its exclusion of other citizens. While I don't deny this, I think there are reasons to weigh such a theory as plausible and even attractive if we clarify the requirements. First, it's worth noting again that this theory does nothing to abrogate the human rights of persons. There are things which I can't do to somebody in light of their personhood. There are things to which I can't do to people no matter where they're from. I can't kill a Frenchman just because he's French, right? Obi and I had to find a Nigerian-Guinean truce over many years of our countrymen's sharp elbows and soccer matches. Those duties don't rely on him and I being members of the same polity. They're just duties in light of him being a human being. And I think it's worth mentioning that many of the things that we find grossest about our current immigration crisis, at least in America, are not problems of equality of citizenship. They're problems of cruel treatment that violate people's human rights. Let me just stop there. Well, I'll say just one last thing. Most of us don't get our intuitions incredibly fired up by the idea that an American living in Paris who lives a life that is differentiated but comfortable, that respects his human rights, is somehow being unjustly treated. The fact that they're differently treated seems perfectly plausible. The Algerians living in Paris, or in the Périphérique, under somewhat oppressive conditions, those do engage our intuitions. But I, again, propose that's not just because of their citizenship status. It's because they're being treated in ways that nobody ought to be treated. Further, and I think this is a subtle but important point, foreign nationals have a right not to be tricked into impoverished lives through hypocritical legal structures. That I take to be analogous to your right to not be defrauded. So I take it to be the case that one of the problems with American immigration law is that our immigration law often not so subtly invites people to work in America in ways that exploits them for economic gain and then leaves them in a eternal legal limbo in order to continue to exploit them for labor. I take it that if the policy is both clear in how you enter and exit, then you might have a very different view of whether or not those people are being unjustly treated. Lastly, I will say, insofar as the claim is those who share a fate with a community are then owed equal voice, it won't be surprising that as people have their lives extended in the place in which they find themselves, a Republican view will make it the case that one now must allow entry into the polity. This will be particularly true of those who are it's not surprising that the dreamers are the ones in America that present the most pressure on our immigration system. Those who are born within our community and grew up within our community seem to, by every measure, share our fate and thus should be allowed. Now, I'll just conclude by saying two things. Notice that if you have these caveats, it's not as clear to me why a Republican theory, which may not grant citizenship as a matter of right, is an unattractive picture of citizenship. So I'll give an example. My father-in-law moved to Saudi Arabia, where my wife was eventually born. And he moved to Saudi Arabia because at the time Saudi Arabia was hiring pilots at a much higher rate than Pakistan, where he lived, where he's Pakistani. It seems to me that if a country invites you in under very clear auspices, tells you the deal, and they lived in a compound where they were treated, though restricted, were treated with respect, had human rights, could come and go. It is not as clear to me that that is a picture that we find necessarily unjust. It may not be a picture that we think is an attractive picture, but it's not a clearly unjust picture of the way in which one can treat immigrants. Indeed, one should notice that even citizens that live within nations, to the extent they entirely exclude themselves, tend to be treated with some volatility or uncertainty by the law. I think here of the American Amish, who have purposely excluded themselves from civic life, and thus the laws have to find a way of negotiating how we're going to treat them. This is just to say that if a nation wants to take as its attitude the kind of attitude Saudi Arabia does, which is to keep a group of people from sharing their fate under conditions of clarity, under conditions of transparency, and under conditions that respect their human rights, while that's not the kind of thing I would vote for, it doesn't seem obviously unjust to me. And I suspect, in fact, if you allow your intuitions to ponder it, it wouldn't seem obviously ridiculous to you. The last thing I want to say is this. Even if that picture is unattractive to you, I think the fact that I work on citizenship sometimes confuses the picture a bit. The fact that I focus so much on it. Citizenship is obviously important, and I've made a plea for why citizenship is an important moral good in the way people find themselves connected. But citizenship is hardly our deepest moral connection. All over the world, all over the country, and I've been a stranger in strange lands. People invite you in, they meet you as you are, they're engaged in you in churches, as co-workers, as friends, sometimes eventually as lovers and as family members. And there are myriad different ways in which we care for each other because we see each other's common humanity. And thus, I think sometimes it's a mistake for us to hope that all the work of treating people with moral decency should be carried in citizenship. We should remember that citizenship ought to be contained to one realm of value in our lives, but only that realm, and aspire to do more than that. So I'll just conclude by saying, even the way in which we started the question might be a problem, because the question says, what do we owe others? And it seems to me that for a healthy polity that wants to view itself with admiration and with care, surely the question cannot only be, what do we owe others? Healthy people and healthy polities aspire to do more than simply give the minimum they owe others.
Thank you very much, Ekow. We have plenty of time for questions. Please make sure you have the microphone when you ask your question, not for purpose of volume, but for the recording.
Thanks again for your second talk today.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that one of the weaknesses of the Republican theory potentially would be a lack of a duty for humanitarian aid. I'm wondering if there might be a further weakness to discuss, that this could lead to great fluctuations in the way that outsiders are treated. If compassion for outsiders is given less status than compassion for insiders, under conditions of economic strife, for instance, this often leads to hardened hearts towards outsiders. So if humanitarianism is a duty, this protects outsiders to a certain extent that they're going to get a baseline of care. And yeah, I wonder if you could just respond to that and how that would.
It's a great question. So I think there's an honest part of me that has to say, I think that's a real problem. Now the question is how big a problem. So what I propose is a certain Republican view that must always, first of all, respect your personage, right? So I think, again, one of the reasons cosmopolitans have a huge intuitive impact is because they often remind us that the cost of not caring for the poorest among us is deep and important deprivation. But that's a deep and important set of deprivation that often violates people's human rights. So inviting guest workers into your country to have them live in unsafe barricades or compounds, to not let them to roam or even have the sort of mobility that is essential to basically flourishing life. And by the way, to not let them have a voice in their own polity, which is to often govern them from the outside, right? Those seem to me to be violations even of persons as such. But if you have the basic respect for those rights, then the question is, what's left over? Now, if you say, look, now you're in a polity where I take my father-in-law's life to be an example. You were invited under certain conditions. You're given certain basic rights. You make, if you're invited under certain conditions and you have freedom of entry and egress, then presumably you're there often for reasons that are important to you, i.e. it's a better deal or there's somebody you want to be around. And then the question is, well, now it turns out that in this society, citizens get X, Y, and Z, but immigrants don't, right? Citizens get greater wealth and immigrants don't. Then I think it's a matter of the character of the society, right? And I agree with you that there may be hardened hearts that give people less than we ought to. But my question is, are you treating them unjustly? And that doesn't seem as clear to me. The last thing I'll say is, as to the question of hardened hearts, I like the way you put the question because you speak about hardened hearts. It seems to me a mistake to imagine that duty is what will make hearts wider. right? I think if I knew that over the years and years and years of our friendship, when I was in the hospital, you were coming to visit me because you were dutiful, something would have gone wrong in our friendship, right? I mean, it's still nice. I mean, you're visiting me, there's that, right? But if the question is, how do we build bonds between persons? To think that we can make duty do all the work, I've always thought is a mistake, right? What we need to do is build societies and cultures that are welcoming rather than dutiful.
Professor Hodgson.
So I want to ask a little bit how you get from this stuff about flirtations going awry to refuting cosmopolitanism. So I thought, I mean, a lot of
Are you dare suggesting there are other reasons why flirtations have gone awry?
but I thought a lot of the examples you gave, they seem more worrying for a certain kind of cultural cosmopolitanism, which is what the Waldron stuff you were mentioning at the beginning seems to be as well, right? People who view themselves as citizens of the world and who view themselves as part of some kind of international culture. And okay, so there are reasons to think that that may not work as well as they think it will. But if we're concerned with moral cosmopolitanism, then I'm not sure that any of the examples suggest that there are fundamental moral differences. It just suggests that the moral principles will apply differently, or some moral principles will apply differently depending on some parameters, right? So what constitutes lying is likely to vary from culture to culture. What constitutes being considerate is going to vary from culture to culture. But there's still going to be the general moral requirement not to lie and to be considerate and so on. Those are not going to be dependent on where you are in the community or what community you're part of. And so then I was kind of wondering if you're not ending up with an instrumental argument of your own, which is sort of the reverse of the Nussbaum. So there's the instrumental argument, I should care more about people around me because I'm going to be more useful that way, and that there seems to be something wrong with that. But now you sort of seem to be saying we should be concerned with our community, because if we start being concerned with the other communities, we're going to do it wrong in all sorts of ways. But that also seems unsatisfying, right? I mean, it's true that when you're approaching a different culture, you have to be very careful, and you may not understand what they want. You may not understand how they do things. But that doesn't seem to me to argue against duties of humanitarian aid at all, right? It just suggests that you should be careful how you carry out your duty.
So there are actually a couple questions embedded in there. But first, thanks as always. It's fun to revisit. We've had a couple rounds like this, and it's fun to revisit this. So let me be sure I understand. I mean, first, it's not clear to me that except for the highest level of abstraction, that I want to say that the moral duties will be the same, right? I mean, that's why I wanted to go as deep as pointing out that even things like pain seem to be expressed deeply differently depending on your culture. Let me give a silly example. So in Ghana, if you're lost and you ask somebody for directions, they will always give you directions, always. And this is true whether they know where you're going or not. Is it the same Nigeria, right? And this is a very weird thing, and I do it when I'm in Ghana as well. I don't know why, right? I just become Ghanaian again. I just give people directions, though I don't live there. And I have no idea where they're going. And we do this, I think, because there's this deep sense that you don't want somebody to be distressed. And it is better that you give them wrong directions that give them a glimmer of hope than it is that you tell them you don't know where they go. It's a very weird thing, but I mean, I don't know. Why do you do it? I mean, that's what we do.
Myself. Yeah.
Pardon?
I don't know. Maybe it's just you're welcome.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
trying to help.
exactly. You want to help, right? But if you wanted to be efficiently helpful, you'd say something like, I don't know where you're going. Right? But we just don't do this. It seems to me if you told a Ghanaian they were lying, they'd just be befuddled by this. They just wouldn't. No, I did my best. I didn't. It's not like I knew where he was going and told him to go someplace else, right? I've had conversations with people in different countries about what counts as corruption, and the answers are vastly different, right? So in America, it's corruption to hire your family members to work in some place when you have the public power to do so.
Or now.
Oh, God. In the America I once knew, It's right. In other countries, it's considered corruption to not do that. I mean, corruption is not the right word, but it'd be considered a neglect of duty to not do so, right? If you have the so, I mean, I want to push back and I want to say I think that they're just even at the most abstract levels of instantiation, it is remarkable what is considered respecting persons and what is not, right? There are cultures in which killing people is a form of respect, and there are cultures in which killing people is a form of disrespect, depending on how it's done, right? There are ways to die, there are ways to live, et cetera, et cetera. So I actually want to push back on that as a first pushback. The second, and this is more to your point, I don't take this to be an instrumental view, because part of my point is, insofar as this is how you come to understand what even counts as reasons in your polity, you'll be doing so because it's the only way for you to live up to your ethical duties, right? So, McIntyre says, look, it's actually impossible to be ethical alone. Part of moral living is communal living, right? And it's not just difficult as a sort of matter of will to do that alone, but it's actually impossible to discern what counts as living well alone. It's impossible to discern whether or not your grandmother should live with you or live in the nicest place you can find, et cetera, and what counts as discharging your duty as a good grandson. So I take it those are reasons that don't sound instrumental reasons. Those are reasons that sound like what count to you as fulfilling a moral duty. Is that at least a first shot reply? Please.
Maybe, although, sometimes these communitarian views sound like they're talking about the order of discovery more than anything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's really hard to become a competent moral agent unless you're being schooled by people in a community and all that. But that still doesn't really address the fact that the main moral duties appear to be universal.
Right, so I want to go deeper than that.
And not just the duty to give adequate directions is usually not on the list of the most fundamental duties,
Well,
but
but
the duties not to cause pain for fun.
Them to, but yes.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Depends where you lead them.
Right. It's
Yeah, but I picked it because you said, there's a duty not to lie. And I just wanted to point out, you can take what looks like a very simple, clean duty, and it turns out it's actually really complicated, right? And I think I can do this with many. I was stunned to find that there is this norm in Kenya to give childbirth in silence. So that presumably what would count as disgusting behavior would, if somebody were to say, what's a universal duty? Or what's a universal permission? One might think crying out when you're in pain. That seems as universal as anything. And it turns out that's not universal either, right? And I'm just forever stunned when I travel to different places, how even what I take to be baseline duties, the most basic duties, including, as you and I know, duties of when you're permitted to let somebody die or to kill them, turn out to be radically different. So I want to push, you're right to point out that if I stay on one level, it will just be instantiation of a general duty, but I want to not stay at that level.
So,
There's a lot of reactions to that point, but yes, and then we're going to go.
if I'm not just one last follow-up.
Yeah.
So I've never been to Kenya. I knew nothing about this custom.
I just learned.
But if I heard that women in Kenya didn't have adequate access to pain medicine because there's this tradition, even though I'm not part of the culture, I would say like, oh, I think there's a problem there.
See, I don't know.
Unless I hear a lot more, I would say that's a problem, even though I'm not part of their community.
So here's one answer that I think is easy. If I heard that women in Kenya simply did not have the choice, I agree with you. Then you might think, oh, this is a complicated situation. Now, here's the more difficult question, and this is the question that Gilfarb and Sen debated about whether or not these cosmopolitan values are actually just Western values masquerading as universal values. If I heard that women in Kenya systematically were turning down pain medication and not screaming, and indeed then the political version would be that we'd have to do X, Y, and Z to subsidize or support this, I would have a much harder time knowing what was going on there, right? Because the point is, the reasons that I would have to hear might be reasons that I don't even understand. Now, I do think, by the way, there are lots of important points here, but one very important point is, I do think it's important for me not to collapse into total relativism, right? So And look, as you know, there are a lot more chapters. There is the backstop, right? So Aristotle's backstop is, these must be structures that are conducive to human flourishing, right? So if, for example, you choose structures because they're not conducive to human flourishing, i.e. you say, around here, we just enslave those people, right? Then I say, well, there are reasons for you to do that, but what you've really done is declare war on another polity, right? And of course, actually, if you make people stop talking in cheap shielding, they understand that, right? The South Africans understood they were at war with Black Africans, right? That's why the townships looked like they did. So I do think that backstop is an important one, but this kind of respect of polity gives a lot more space for polities to define themselves.
Professor Pacheco, if you can pass the microphone down.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question that I fear is extremely basic, but I'll compensate by first offering a small anecdote, which you can do with what you will in contrast with your Kenyan example. When my mom birthed me, she apparently had a British nurse who looked at her chart and said, Pacheco, that's an Italian name. But that's your married name, right? And my mom said, yes, but my maiden name's Esposti. And she said to me, I know what she was thinking. She was thinking, damn, I've got a screamer, because there was just this cultural assumption that the Italian women were all gonna yell, which in my mom's case, I think was probably accurate. But in any event, the actual question though is, at what level of sort of specificity or granularity do you want to actually define polity? Like, it strikes me that at moments it felt like we were equating culture and nation. And I mean, as François can attest, like this would play out very differently if we said Quebec is part of the polity of Canada versus Quebec's a polity, for example, right? So I'm just wondering, how do you unpack that?
No, that's great. So I think this is very difficult. I mean, here, and as I said, I'm working this paper out, I'm working this chapter out as we speak. Here's my instinct. And again, I rush to point out that not everything I think is permissible is something for which I would vote. But it seems to me that there's no clear answer to this, right? So it seems to me one of the great things about modern citizenship is that we have a concept that is larger than nation. Actually, no, let me take that back. One of the great things about citizenship is that we have a culture, a concept that's greater than nation. And I am sometimes accused of being romantic and having a theory that only applies to charming Athenian city-states of 4,000 years ago, but that are useless. And I say to those people, you should learn something about the charming Athenian city-states of 4,000 years ago. There are bitter, bitter fights about who counts as an Athenian, about what we're going to do with these barbarians, these strangers on our streets, who should be incorporated, what should happen to their children, et cetera, et cetera. These debates could be ripped out of ancient Athens and slapped on the pages of the New York Times without much difference. So the idea that the human condition is somehow radically different today, I'm actually one of the people who rejects Weber's intuition that modernity has changed our moral tractions. I think many of these problems are time immemorial. That's just a way of saying that the nice thing about the idea of citizenship is that it is open. In particular, one of the things I was proudest about America that has taken deep suffering blows recently is the idea that our notion of citizenship has long been porous across ethnic and national lines. Now, that being said, look, I mean, here's the question. Do I think it is totally illegitimate for a country that has a coherent nation to seek to preserve that? No. I think it's unwise. I think it can be ugly. And by the way, I think it's often dangerous for that nation, right? Which is to say, we should try to imagine the world that we're talking about. The world that we're talking about is a nation that, as it increasingly has people of different ethnic origins, tries ever harder to keep those people from sharing the same fate. You can do that, but you do that at great cost to yourself, at great risk to yourself, because part of what you do is you have a group of people living in your society who you are telling, you don't count here, right? You are not full citizens. We don't owe you. But what nations often forget that means is you don't owe us, right? So it's not surprising when those nations come unraveled. It's not surprising that South Africa becomes unraveled. It's not surprising that America has this deep problem with Native Americans on the reservations. Insofar as nations are blind to the importance of inviting and building citizens, those nations put themselves at risk. But polities are permitted to make stupid, ugly decisions, right? I think that's not impermissible. I think it's just deeply unwise.
So then you would define a polity as sort of being the equivalent to a nation, but then you would regard the way in which the polity sort of does or doesn't include its diverse members as being just some sort of imperative.
Oh, no, sorry. What I
so
meant,
I'm not-
yeah, no, what I meant to say is I think citizenship is broader than nation,
Okay.
but there are polities that decide. The concept of citizenship, my claim is the concept of citizenship non-trivially has been broader than nation for 5,000 years. And that's a non-trivial fact, right? So the idea that polity and nation always have to collapse into each other is just empirically false.
Right.
But of course it is true, South Korea has, I've been told something like 80% of the last name, there's 6 last names in South Korea that cover 80% of the population, right? I don't know if that's still true. It was true when I read it. Anyway, if that nation seeks to preserve itself and can do so, okay, right? I think it's increasingly difficult in today's world. And a nation that increasingly tries to do that puts itself at real risk for eventually fraying of the civic bonds and dissolution. But I think the nice thing about the concept of citizen is nations that choose to be broader, states that choose to have their citizenship be broader than a nation have a concept like citizen on which they can rely.
Yeah.
Microphone.
I hear you being rather skeptical of cosmopolitan claims, and I'm very much in sympathy with that. It's interesting that I listening to you, I've just been thinking of taking the analysis beyond humanity, and I'm thinking, that dogs will hunt in packs and cats will hunt singly, and sparrows will flock, but eagles don't. And there's all kinds of group behavior in species other than humanity.
As you know, this is on which Aristotle built in the Animalia, right?
Yeah.
So Aristotle builds he says, look, there are animals that live alone. There are animals that live beside each other, right? So cows don't live together. They live beside each other, right? But human beings live together, right? And so he tries very much to make it a natural theory that way.
And when I look at humans, I think, well, it's vastly more complicated than any of that, just because of the way humans are. And if you ask me if I think Toronto is a single polis, I think only in a very artificial sense, and let alone broader human collectivities than that, right? It gets more and more artificial to talk that way, and as humans, we're very accustomed to use talk of rights and duties, but I think that kind of language is not very likely to be explanatory at any deep level. That's kind of the...
Yeah. Let me just say a couple words on that, because that's helpful to say. Look, when I give these kind of theories, it's often surprising to my friends who know how liberal I am in other realms, because they find, rights have always had this attraction of being able to push back liberally. I'll just say 2 quick things on what you're saying. One is, I actually agree with you that rights and duties, as we were touched upon, are often chimerical, which is to say, it turns out that polities that are not willing to accept certain people as members of those equal polities are typically not willing to extend them rights either, right? So it's not as though speaking in antebellum America, it's not like people didn't understand both the concept of citizens and rights. They simply circumvented them the same way, right? If you didn't want blacks to be citizens, Dred Scott, they weren't citizens. If you thought black or Africans weren't rights carriers, you just said they weren't rights carriers. So I tend to think it doesn't, frankly, the retreat into the language of rights and duties is rarely as helpful as people think it is. And that's true if you've ever lived someplace where there's a deep fracturing of the civic bonds. But the second thing, your point about artificiality, I think is absolutely right. One of the nice things about focusing on our civic bonds is it reminds us that these bonds need attention and must be built. So Francois knows a lot more about India than I do. One of the remarkable things about India is how self-consciously the Indian state set about to build an idea of a nation state. How very self-consciously they decided to generate the idea. This was true, by the way, of Italy 150 years ago. It's true of Germany, even after Italy, right? They just decided we're going to create a German nation, right? Italy decided we're going to create an Italian language. They picked Dante's Inferno as the language, and they started printing leaflets all across the country, right? This is how Italy came to be a modern state. Before it was just a city. just regions, right? People in northern India look nothing like people in southern India. The nice thing about reminding ourselves of civic bonds is it's a reminder that if we're going to care for each other, we have to build citizens. We have to build citizenship together and not just assume that the rights that we hold as human beings will be sufficient.
Mike, one comment and one question. So the comment, when I vote for something, I typically try to vote for something I think is, after best consideration, permissible, justifiable, presumably correct, and all things considered best.
Yes.
Right? So how is that different from what the theorists should try to achieve? Right? You seem to say,
Yeah.
well, that's a bit bizarre. So that for me, that didn't strike a chord the way you seem to think.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Well, okay, so we can have a discussion about
Yeah.
that. In terms of the question, so you acknowledge that there are citizenship rights and duties, and you also recognize in a more cosmopolitan term that there are such things as human rights and human duties. So the big question is, where is the boundaries between the two, right? So let's imagine a real life situation. The question of the burden that is imposed on aliens upon deportation comes in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court is asked to decide whether that those people should be afforded the same procedural protection as local Americans in determining whether they should suffer this heavy burden, right? So should you have the same protections that you'd have in the criminal process when you're confronted with punishment? So irrespective of how the court decides the issue, which I think is by determining that it needs to be punishment or not, and how you know this is whether it's intended to be punishment or not, there are different ways of evaluating this claim, right? You could say, well, what would happen to them could be pretty terrible, right? You send them back to countries where their fate might be worse than death, and so on and so forth. And therefore, as a matter of human right, you ought to afford them these kind of guarantees. Other people might turn around and say, no, these are citizenship rights, right? So you're afforded certain kind of treatment by the polity by virtue of being part of it. The question of immigration is just delimiting the boundaries. You're not yet in it, right? So how do you go into fine grain trying to delimit these issues? Because it seems to me that insofar as you're going to acknowledge both, and especially citizenship rights and duties can go so deep into what other people might think are just universal cosmopolitan human rights and duties, then so how do you negotiate that in practice? It seems to me that it's going to be a very hard sell for a theory like yours confronted with issues like this, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Francois. Let me start with the first. The first one I feel more comfortable with. The second is the first is difficult, but the second is impossible. So let me start with the first. I'm surprised you say you find a distinction between permissible versus best. Because your voting example actually, I think, undermines the point, right? So most of the time we feel very uncomfortable voting unless we think we're voting within the range of permissible, right? So that already implies a difference, right? I mean, the fact that I'm voting for one thing and my fellow citizens are voting for another, again, this is a particularly horrible time to be having this conversation. But in a normal situation, I typically think I'm trying to vote for what's best, but I typically recognize that what my fellow citizens are voting for is permissible, right? I mean, I think the tax rate should be much higher to allow more social welfare benefits. They think it should be much lower because they think the government shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. Not cannot do X, Y, and Z, but shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. I think those are perfectly normal civic conversations, right? And I think it's weird that we all we all now, speaking of occupational hazards among certain theorists in the room, that we all spend so much time trying to find theories that only emit answers that we would vote for. I think that's very, very strange. So why is it that that distinction seems odd to you?
Well, it just seems to me that whenever I vote, I want to vote for something that's permissible. Right?
Sure, no, but that's not true. You want to vote for something that's at least permissible,
right.
But then you typically want to vote for something best.
Presumably,
right?
So, but the task of the theorist is something like that too, right? So you want your theory to be within the range of permissible, and then you're going to make try to your best effort to get to the best permissible.
That might be okay. That might be right, but that's a good point. So I take this project to be slightly different because this project is about what I take to be the bonds of political obligation, and I take the bonds of political obligation to be different than the question of an ideal polity, right? I think there are ways in which we're obliged to each other that don't define the best way we can be as a community, right? And I think that's just true across most of the ways we're bonded, right? I mean, there are things that I owe my colleagues, and then there are things I ought to do for my colleagues out of more than owing for them, right? I mean, there are things that I owe you. I'm sure there are things I owe you, right? Papers that I meant to have done, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are ways in which I should treat you as a colleague because we've grown to be collegial and friends, and et cetera, et cetera. And it'd be weird if you said you have to do these things for me because you owe them to me. You'd say, no, I think the best way for us to treat each other, or, you know, when you're voting over the ways in which Osgoode organizes itself, it's just weird when somebody stands up and says, I have a right to this treatment about everything. Just after a while, roll
Your
your
point
eyes.
is about overly rigid theories.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my point is to swallow the. I want to be able to bite the bullet that says there are permissible instantiations of this theory that I don't find attractive, but I think are permissible, right? Like the polity that decides to be closed-minded and wants to restrict its citizenship as much as possible.
Fine again, but it's just simply that it actually doesn't make sense for a philosopher to identify sort of generally what I find to be intuitive and then reverse engineer and jerry-rig first principles to serve it, as opposed to think deeply about first principles and then assess where you go from there. That actually strikes me as quite intuitive.
That's another way of, you would think it's intuitive, but I mean, look, I have friends I really, really respect tremendously, and I just find it weird that their book eventually catalogs exactly their voting record. That is strange, right?
Yeah, but that's a full methodology. People who are intuitionists about philosophy just they think that that's the raw data on which they have to build the theory. So you're just opposing that.
No, I think
no,
being
but many people
intuitionist is
don't.
fine, right? But they reverse engineer it all the way back to permissibility, not even to ideal, but to permissibility. I find that very strong, right? So that's what I'm saying there. The harder question is about the boundaries between human rights and citizens' rights. So your particular example I'm okay with, because I do think it is hard to not understand that being destroyed physically would not be a violation of your ability to.
But it doesn't need to be this. It could be you will suffer a burden by being deported.
Yeah, no, there'll be burdens. I think that's right. By the way, I actually think there might be a really hard example that's on yours. You can imagine if you're a state that doesn't believe in the death penalty. You think another state does believe in the death penalty, but they don't have, let's say they're a state that applies the death penalty as justly as you can imagine it to be applied, right? So if you don't think death penalty can at all be just, I understand, but imagine it is applied in a way that's non-arbitrary, non-racist, and with full representational rights. And you understand that this person has committed a crime which is egregious in his community, which will make him liable for the death penalty. It's not obvious to me you can't deport him, right? It's just not obvious to me. It seems very obvious to my friends, and I'm not sure why. Maybe they'll have to explain. Maybe the intuition just is destruction of body is such a human right that it can't be. But anyway, what I want to say is I think, you don't get to deport people to be tortured. There are just certain things where any plausible version of human rights will not permit that to be respected. But that doesn't get to your point. And your point is, well, what about deportation? And there I just want to bite the bullet. Look, I mean, so my cutoff is when a person has been with you so long that they share your fate, they deserve a voice in the polity, right? So that, the claims that I think really move our intuitions are the 30-year-old person who moved to the country when they were 3, and now they're being deported to a country they've never known or don't speak the language. And there I want to say that person, in every significant sense, shares the fate of the polity in which they live, and thus they should have a voice and ought not be deported. But now you give me an example where that's not true. So I moved to France. I lived there for 5 years, right? Not an insignificant amount of time, right? I'm deeply in love with some French version of my current wife. It's not my first rodeo. It is a version of my current wife. And notwithstanding that, we're not married, but I'm in love with her, et cetera, et cetera. Notwithstanding that, I violate some law, which obviously would not make me eligible for deportation or banishment if I were French, but makes me eligible for deportation as an American citizen. I think that's very tough. I think it's very rough. I think it's brutal. it's not clear to me it's impermissible. It seems to me
So the question is not, is deportation permissible, right? So punishment might be permissible, is how you need to treat the
Yeah,
person.
even-
Okay.
even under different, even if I don't have the full kinds of, I mean, I'm assuming that the due process rights are going to be even subsumed because they're, as you know, in America, oddly enough in America, and I actually think this undergirds a certain Republican view, America makes it constitutional to impose the death penalty, but it is unconstitutional to strip somebody of their citizenship. Right? There's sort of an odd feature there. Right? You can kill somebody, but you can't strip them. You can't make them You can't make them stateless. No state can make them stateless if they believe in the Human Rights Convention. But you also can't strip them of their citizenship. I think that's a deep claim. I think the point there is citizenship in some ways is even prior to, prior to life. And I think there's something in that. So yeah, I think even if it's the case that I'm being deported under conditions which wouldn't be permitted to the citizen, and I assume that's the case since as American I couldn't be deported. Yeah, it strikes me as something against which I would vote. It strikes me as something I would write my congressman to try to change. It doesn't strike me as obviously impermissible for the French to say, if you commit these crimes, we'll deport you back to some nation where you will not otherwise be cruelly, your human rights will be violated, but you'll be made to uproot yourself in a way that's deeply hurtful. Yeah. Last thing I want to say, and we shouldn't pretend that the reason is because it's not deeply painful. We shouldn't pretend that at all.
Any further thoughts, comments, puzzles, questions? No.
I've shocked everybody into silence.
Yeah. I want to ask more about
The humanitarian aid stuff that you seem to take a very hard line on.
Do you think so?
Well, maybe I misunderstood or I wasn't following, but it seemed like you were saying our duties of humanitarian aid are, it's like it'd be nice if we did it, but.
I say I don't think that's a hard lie. I mean, and I wouldn't say it'd be nice. I mean, I don't
It'd be
think,
ideal, but it's permissible not to do anything. Is that your view?
yeah, look, I think if you are a polity that has not harmed another polity, and by the way, that's itself is an important limiting feature, right? Because many of the claims that other polities have against us is that we have used our power in ways to extract wealth from them. But let's say that it's the case that these are truly strangers to you. You've never met them in a sense, right? And you are vastly wealthy and they are not. And you as a polity just decide, we want to be a wealthy house that shares nothing. And that is the character of our polity. I think that's disgraceful. But I don't take it to be a hard line insofar as I think it's actually, it's a hell of a thing to decide that you're just going to be a wealthy polity that cares nothing for other people's pain. I think our
What does hell of a thing mean in this context?
So it's a great point. All right, so let me speak more plainly. Because I believe polities have characters, and because I believe that polities come together to define their own sense of the common good, I think it's a non-trivial fact that a polity that wrestles with this will have to take a real look at itself. And I think most people, and even many nations, frankly, America is actually terrible on this, would come to understand that they've done something very wrong, if not impermissible, that this is the character they've chosen. Right? And I think that's a non-trivial thing to realize about yourself, that you're a greedy, selfish people. Right? But sorry, I'd cut you off.
But it's still permissible.
Yeah. I think it's permissible to be a greedy, selfish house. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And you have to tell me why it's not.
Well, I wonder if the category of permissibility doesn't apply very differently to groups than it does to individuals. Because I feel like part of what's driving your intuitions about what's permissible is the importance for a polity to come together and define, and we know that that's hard, right? We know that civil wars can happen and so on. And then there may be this other interference with our intuitions that forcing a polity to do something is very dangerous, right? And so in general, if the US says we're going to be selfish bastards, most other countries will say, well,
Not much we can do. Yeah.
less than ideal.
Yeah.
actually, it's probably wrong, but we're not going to do anything about it. That would be insane. And then there's this, we say, oh, well, it's up to them to decide. It's up to the American people to decide and all that. But, to say it's permissible, I don't know. That seems to be,
Well, so you and
at the
I,
very least, it seems to have a different meaning than when we say it's permissible for an individual. To
well,
do something.
you now, but now, I mean, you usually, your points are so powerful that I'm usually on the back foot. So I take delight in being able to flip the question. Now you have to tell me why you think the word permissible is being used differently. Because I take it to be standard usage, right? I don't think there's a large gap between group permissibility in this realm. In fact, one of the reasons I don't is because I think group accountability and group blameworthiness also exist, right? So I think you're blameworthy as a polity, right? I think America is blameworthy as a polity for having elected Donald Trump. And I think no matter what Donald Trump does, we will always have been blameworthy as a polity for doing so, right?
Yeah.
And I think the same would be true if we decide not to give. Last thing I want to say before I ask you for a rejoinder, you and I had this debate once on a similar subject, and I pointed out one of the things that's odd is because we're lucky enough to live in a wealthy nation, we're typically thinking about the way in which our duties flow to other poorer nations. But in fact, those of us who have lived or come from poor nations, I think my intuitions actually accord more with those intuitions, right? So at least from my experience, people who live in nations that have been colonized often do feel like those who colonized them and have done serious damage to their political self-determination owe them some reparative features, right? So I think that's clear. And then certain sophisticated thinkers often point out the way in which the IMF and the World Bank and other global institutions are structured to take advantage, right? So that's the claim of justice that Betts have. And I think that's right. But when I'm in Ghana, outside of that, most people just don't think Canada should just start pouring money into Ghana. They just don't think, it's just, there is this sort of idea of self-determination and self-respect that says it'd be great if the Canadians invested. It'd even be great if they gave us aid. But we just don't have this feeling that the Canadians owe Ghana some sort of wealth. And it's a very strange thing that all my liberal friends in Canada think Canada does, but the Ghanaians actually don't, right? And so that needs some explanation as well, if you see it'd be odd if we just said, well, we should let Canada run these public sectors because they're better at it and maybe they'll get a vote or they just owe us money I don't see that conversation when I'm in Ghana.
False consciousness.
Yeah, you might think they're all fooled into thinking they should be a self-determining nation. I don't think we're fooled. I think there's a pride in thinking you ought to be a nation that, to the best of your ability, can sustain yourself. Now, the last thing I'll say is I do think those who are in crushing poverty often think those who have great wealth should help them. But again, those claims are simple human rights claims. They are, if you understood me to be a person, how can you stand there and buy yet another plasma screen TV and let me starve? But that's true of people who've never met each other, right? The child in the favelas of Brazil just thinks, have you no humanity? They don't make claims of obligation. They make claims of moral duty or political duty. They don't make claims of political obligation. They make claims of moral duty. That's my experience from the other side of the bridge, but
Okay.
maybe you can correct
Right.
me.
So this is helpful because I wasn't sure where human rights fit in this whole picture because I would have thought if we're violating the human rights of people who are completely destitute, then we're doing something impermissible.
Yes.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Right, but how are we violating their rights? You have to give me that story a little bit.
So they're starving in the streets.
Right.
And we're doing nothing. So that's impermissible. Or is it, because I feel like it sounds like you want to say, no, as a polity, we can decide to do nothing. But then we're selfish bastards as individuals and we're all going to hell.
So my view of violating their human rights was that we have done something which unjustly creates their misery. So for example, we have pulled the levers of power in the IMF to constantly keep the nation in the kind of debt where, so countries do this, right? So in order to keep cocoa crops cheap, we manipulate the way in which countries have to get loans to produce cocoa crops, right? And then we refine the chocolate over here and sell it back at 10 times what it's otherwise would be worth. I think that might be a violation. But that's why I tried to take the example of a nation you're just literally meeting, right? Where they're destitute. There, it's not as clear to me we violated their human rights. Is that a clear enough distinction?
One last comment.
Yeah, this is another tangential thought, but I'm just thinking about collective action in professional sports, right? That, you know, baseball is played as team sports, right? Team against team competition, but then at some other parts of the year, it's the Players Association against the owners. But all the time, they settle their differences because it's owners and players collectively against the ticket-buying public, right? To make themselves fabulously wealthy at the expense of others. And I remember as a kid, we used to play an individual team version of baseball, right? We called it scrub, right? Where you played as an individual and you just worked your way up to be a batter, and the goal was to be a batter as long as possible. And if you were out, then you went back into the field and somebody else moved into your place. But the profession doesn't organize baseball that way because it wouldn't sell as well. People just like it as a team sport with that kind of team competition. And I think there's a lot of that deeply in humanity, that we're not going to play the human game generally as an individual sport.
I think that's right. I mean, unlike you, and maybe I'm in the bad position that America seems to be the nation that most easily is both the wealthiest and most easily flouts this. But I think most nations just think, we don't want to be that kind of people, right? We don't want to be the kind of people who see gross misery across our borders and shrug.
On this note, please join me in thanking Ekow for yet another thought-provoking talk. Thank you for having survived the day.
No,
Survived all good, Ekow.
my pleasure.
And as a token of our appreciation, you get a mug.
All right. Thank you very much.